What would you do if your boss called you a slave in front of everyone? For Brian Daniels, that moment wasn't the end. It was the spark that ignited a revolution in his workplace and beyond. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of a sleek, open-plan office in Austin, Texas. The faint hum of keyboards filled the room, punctuated by the occasional sound of muted laughter from co-workers sharing small talk. It was a routine Monday, but for Brian, it felt like anything but ordinary. Every morning felt like a battle he couldn't avoid. Brian Daniels, a 34-year-old black man with a penchant for crisp suits and quiet determination, had been working at Bexley & Coombe for 5 years. It wasn't just a job to him. It was his chance to break generational barriers. His family had always believed in the power of hard work, and Brian embodied that belief. But lately, he felt the weight of his efforts crumbling under the unspoken tension that lingered between him and his manager, Annette Sullivan. Annette was a sharp, no-nonsense leader who had risen quickly through the ranks. To some, she was a symbol of perseverance. To Brian, she had become the source of unrelenting, simmering hostility. It started small, a dismissive tone, ignoring his ideas in meetings, and calling out his mistakes louder than anyone else's. Over time, her actions became harder to ignore. For Brian, every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, knowing one misstep could send him plummeting. On this particular morning, Brian walked into the office, gripping a mug of coffee and mentally preparing himself for the day. He had a big presentation coming up, one he'd spent weeks perfecting. But when he reached his desk, he noticed his presentation slides had been altered. His carefully crafted points were stripped down, replaced with bullet points that barely scratched the surface of his work. Annette's initials were stamped at the bottom of the document. A wave of frustration hit him, but he kept his composure. This wasn't the first time Annette had taken credit for his work, and Brian knew confronting her would only make things worse. Yet he couldn't let this slide, not this time. "Good morning, Brian." Annette's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stood at his desk, arms crossed and lips curled in a smug smile. "I made a few changes to your slides. They were a bit too complicated." Brian looked up, meeting her gaze with a steady calm he didn't entirely feel. "I see that," he replied, his tone measured. "I'd have appreciated a heads up before you made those changes." Her smile faltered for a split second, then returned sharper than before. "Well, that's why I'm the manager. I know what works for our clients." It was a subtle jab, but it landed squarely. Brian clenched his jaw but didn't respond. He knew better than to argue in the middle of the office, but he couldn't shake the feeling that today, something was going to tip the scales. Still, Brian didn't know just how far things were about to escalate, or how this one day would change everything. The day dragged on as Brian prepared to deliver his presentation. His frustration over Annette's interference simmered beneath the surface, but he kept his focus. He had learned to pick his battles carefully, knowing that every confrontation carried an invisible weight in the workplace. By the time the team gathered in the conference room, the tension was palpable. Brian had rehearsed every line of his presentation, determined to make the best of the altered slides. As he sat up, Annette leaned casually against the doorframe, a cup of tea in hand and an air of superiority around her. The room filled quickly, co-workers chatting, some reviewing their notes, others scrolling on their phones. Annette clapped her hands sharply to get everyone's attention. "Let's get started. Brian, the floor is yours," she said, her tone clipped and dismissive. Brian took a deep breath and began. Despite the changes, he delivered his points with clarity and confidence, weaving in details Annette had stripped from the slides. His co-workers nodded along, clearly impressed by his grasp of the subject matter. But Annette's icy glare told a different story. She interrupted him twice, questioning points he knew were solid. The interruptions weren't about clarity, they were about undermining him. Still he pressed on, refusing to let her derail him. As he wrapped up, the room erupted in applause. One of his colleagues, Vanessa, spoke up. "Great job, Brian. That was really insightful." Annette's smile didn't reach her eyes. Yes, well, it seems Brian had some help with this, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The team effort really shines through. The jab stung, but Brian kept his expression neutral. The meeting ended, and as people filtered out, Annette stopped him. "A word in my office," she said curtly. Her office was as cold and unwelcoming as her demeanor. She gestured for him to sit, but Brian remained standing, sensing this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Let's cut to the chase," Annette began, her tone icy. "You've been walking a fine line lately, and I need to remind you who's in charge. The way you handled that presentation, borderline insubordination." Brian blinked, stunned. Insubordination? For delivering a presentation effectively. Her eyes narrowed. For going beyond what was necessary. "You made me look incompetent in front of the team." The accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud. Brian couldn't believe what he was hearing. "With all due respect, Annette, I simply wanted to present the full scope of my work." Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. "Don't forget your place here, Brian. You're not the decision maker. You do the work you're assigned, and you leave the thinking to people like me." It was in that moment, as the words "people like me" lingered in the air, that something inside Brian snapped. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. Annette didn't back down. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You know what I mean. You're here to follow orders, not to play hero, or have you forgotten where you come from?" The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Then, almost as if she had crossed some invisible line she couldn't see, Annette delivered the blow. "You're nothing more than a glorified slave in this office." The words hit like a thunderclap. Brian's chest tightened. His hands balled into fists at his sides, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He needed a moment to process, to channel the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But silence wasn't an option. Brian knew he had to respond. And when he did, it would be a moment no one in that office would ever forget. Brian took a deep breath, his mind racing as Annette's words echoed in his ears. He felt the heat of anger rising, but he knew that giving in to rage wasn't the answer. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been belittled, disrespected, or dehumanized. He had to choose his words carefully. He stepped closer to her desk, his voice steady but carrying the weight of generations. "Annette," he began, his tone calm yet piercing, "what you just said is not only offensive, it's unacceptable, and I won't stand here and let you degrade me or anyone else like that." Annette leaned back in her chair, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "You're being dramatic," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it usually carried. Brian shook his head. "No, I'm being honest. Let me tell you something, Annette. My great-grandfather worked himself to the bone as a sharecropper in Mississippi. He picked cotton for wages that could barely feed his family, yet he dreamed of something better for his children. My grandfather marched in Selma, fought for the right to vote, and never stopped believing in equality. And my father. He spent his life telling me that no matter how much the world tries to tear you down, you keep pushing forward because your worth isn't defined by someone else's prejudice." The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Brian's voice grew stronger, more resolute. "I didn't come here to be anyone's punching bag. I've worked hard, harder than you can imagine, to be where I am today. And no matter how much you try to belittle me, you can't take that away." Annette opened her mouth to speak, but Brian held up his hand. "No, let me finish. You don't get to interrupt this time. You've had your say. Now it's my turn." He turned toward the office window, his gaze focused on the bustling street below. "Do you know how exhausting it is to walk into a place every day knowing you're judged not by your skills or your work ethic but by the color of your skin? To carry the weight of expectations, assumptions, and stereotypes everywhere you go. And still I show up. I show up because I refuse to let people like you define my story." Brian looked back at her, his eyes blazing with determination. "I deserve respect, Annette. Not because of my title, not because of my credentials, but because I'm a human being. And so does everyone else in this office. He stepped closer to her desk, his voice dropping to a level that felt almost intimate yet commanding. What you said wasn't just wrong, it was a reflection of something deeper, something this company needs to address. Because if this is the culture you're fostering, then it's time for a change. As he finished speaking, the door to Annette's office creaked open. Several co-workers stood there, their faces a mix of shock and admiration. They had heard everything. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. Brian, that was incredible. And you're absolutely right. This has gone on for far too long. One by one, the others nodded in agreement. The atmosphere had shifted, the weight of unspoken truths now hanging heavy in the air. But the ripple of change had only just begun, and Brian knew this was far from over. The real battle was still ahead. The silence in the office was deafening as Brian stepped out of Annette's office. The faces of his co-workers reflected a whirlwind of emotions: shock, discomfort, admiration, and for some, guilt. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew there was no turning back now. Annette stayed in her office, her expression frozen somewhere between anger and disbelief. She had underestimated him, and now, for the first time, she seemed to realize she had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Brian's pulse raced as he walked back to his desk, his hands still trembling slightly. He had said what needed to be said, but part of him wondered how the company would respond. Would they brush it off, or would they finally acknowledge the deep-seated issues that had been allowed to fester for years? Later that afternoon, an email from Human Resources landed in everyone's inbox. The subject line read, "Immediate meeting, workplace conduct." Brian's stomach churned as he clicked on the message. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m., mandatory for all staff. When the time came, the conference room was packed. Annette sat stiffly at the head of the table, her usual air of authority replaced with visible discomfort. The HR director, a composed woman named Elena Chavez, stood at the front of the room. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Good afternoon, everyone. As some of you may be aware, an incident occurred today that has brought to light serious concerns about our workplace culture. We're here to address that." Elena's gaze swept across the room before landing on Brian. "First, I want to thank Brian for his courage in speaking up. It takes immense strength to confront injustice, especially in an environment where it's been allowed to persist." Annette shifted in her seat, but she said nothing. Elena continued, "What happened today is unacceptable. Let me be clear. Bexley and Company has a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or harassment. As of this moment, an internal investigation is underway, and appropriate actions will be taken." The room was still, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, Brian felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had endured similar experiences in silence. After the meeting, co-workers began approaching Brian, their words tentative but sincere. Vanessa was the first. "Brian, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have said something sooner. I saw how she treated you and I didn't do anything. That's on me." Another co-worker, Kevin, added, "Man, I don't even know what to say. You stood up for all of us today, whether we realize it or not." Brian accepted their apologies with grace, but he made one thing clear. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. If we want change, it has to come from all of us." The next few days were a whirlwind. Annette was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and whispers about her behavior began circulating throughout the office. Stories emerged. Others who had been mistreated, overlooked, or belittled by her but had been too afraid to speak up. But Brian didn't revel in the fallout. He focused on what mattered most, making sure this was the start of something bigger. Even as the office began to shift, Brian knew the journey wasn't over. Real change would take time, and he wasn't about to stop now. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere at Bexley and Company began to change. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being held openly. The HR department launched a comprehensive initiative to address workplace bias, bringing in outside consultants to lead workshops and facilitate discussions about diversity and inclusion. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Brian became an unlikely leader in these efforts. Co-workers sought him out for advice, and his presence at company meetings carried a newfound respect. He wasn't just the man who stood up to Annette. He was a symbol of resilience, someone who had turned a moment of adversity into a catalyst for change. Annette's investigation concluded with her termination. The company issued a formal statement apologizing for the incident and reaffirming its commitment to creating a respectful work environment. For Brian, the news was bittersweet. He didn't celebrate her firing. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture. One afternoon, Elena approached Brian with an idea. "We'd like to start a diversity council, and I think you'd be the perfect person to lead it. You've shown incredible strength, and we want to make sure voices like yours are at the forefront of this company's future." Brian hesitated, the weight of the responsibility settling on him. But as he looked around the office, the faces of his co-workers, some hopeful, others still unsure, he realized he couldn't say no. "I'd be honored," he said, "but this has to be about all of us, not just me. Everyone here needs to feel like they have a voice." The council's first meeting was a turning point. Employees shared stories, some painful, others inspiring. They discussed ways to improve hiring practices, ensure equal opportunities for advancement, and create a culture where everyone felt valued. Brian listened, taking notes and making sure no one's voice was left unheard. Outside of work, the incident sparked conversations in the broader community. Brian was invited to speak at local events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up against injustice, no matter where they encountered it. His message was simple. Change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we have the courage to speak out, even when it's hard. As time went on, Bexley & Company became a case study for how a company could confront its shortcomings and grow. It wasn't easy, and mistakes were made along the way, but the commitment to doing better remained steadfast. For Brian, the journey was far from over. But as he walked into the office one morning, greeted by smiles and nods from his co-workers, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had taken a stand, and it had mattered. And so, to anyone watching this story unfold, remember this. Your voice is your power. Speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. Challenge prejudice wherever you find it, because real change starts with courage, and courage starts with you. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change and spark important conversations. Together we can create a better, more just world.